Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad you could join me today, and I want to say a big thank you to CSW for making this possible for us today, and to welcome you all from near and far today. So I hope you'll enjoy the demo, and I'm going to start talking about what we're doing right away. So let's go over to the table and take a look and see what we need to know. So here's the subject that I sent out to you, the image that I sent out to you. That's not actually the one I'm going to demonstrate today. This is the subject that we'll be painting in the workshop. If you'd like to come and join me next weekend, if you'd like to paint your own subject like this street scene. So I have a few different street scenes here, but fundamentally this subject is mainly wet in wet. And that's what I wanted to share with you today, the idea of making a large wet in wet wash that takes care of most of the painting right at the very beginning. It's a very good way of simplifying a subject that's really complicated like this. And you'll see when I start that my drawing has just a little bit more detail than will end up in the final painting. So that's a good thing to know too. But when you're working like this with big wet and wet washes, it's a really good idea to use 300-pound paper, because 300-pound paper stays wet much longer. It's like card, and it stays wet for a long time. In California, particularly, we have a real problem keeping the paper wet. When I'm painting in England, I'm always amazed at how long it takes for things to dry over there. And so one of the ways that we can deal with that is to use a paper that stays wet a lot longer. And 300-pound paper will do that. Here's another version of a street scene that is a possibility for you. I did several here so that you could see some suggestions of how these might work, and see the distance that we can achieve by washing out the back part of the painting, bringing the light forward through to the front of the painting. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today more than anything. This is the demonstration that I'm going to be doing for you, but a slightly smaller version of this. Okay, so because of the time and the time that it takes with the small amount of detail there is, I'm just doing a more of a square version of this for you today. So again, we're keeping the light as much as possible in the center of the painting, letting the light flow through from the back to the front, and really diminishing any detail towards the back of the painting completely. So let me move that one out of the way. Other subjects that would work really well on this paper for this method are subjects where you have a background that needs a lot of work. You need time to add in more and more color. You need time to lift out. You need time to change things. So this would be a subject that 300-pound paper would work really well for. Again, something like this where you have a background that needs multiple layers, needs a lot of interest, needs a lot of layering, needs a lot of working while it's still wet. That would also be a good subject for using 300-pound paper. Now, a lot of you may not have 300-pound paper. You may not have used it before. So I'm just going to show you in my journal another possibility for using paper that is not 300-pound, for using 140-pound paper. So this is one of my journal pages here from the teaching journals. And on one side of the page in this book, I have a sunset scene. This is 140-pound paper. If you're going to use 140-pound paper and you want to get these nice washes and you want to build up a lot of color, you want it to stay wet long enough to be able to do that, then you have to wet the paper front and back. Soak it completely. Put it on a surface that is like a plastic surface that will hold the moisture in the paper. And that's the way that you can get around the idea of keeping your paper wet long enough over here to be able to do that. So here's one possibility. Here's another possibility that was painted in the same way, with the paper being wet front and back. Okay, so it is possible to do this on 140-pound paper. It is absolutely necessary to have 300-pound paper. But 300-pound paper is very helpful because it stays wet for a long time. And that's what we're going to do right away. So we'll look at the subject in just a second. Many of you have asked in these demonstrations if where I get my palette from and the colors that are in the palette. So I've put this up as a PDF for you on the portfolio section of this site. Okay, if you go under the menu, you'll find portfolio and you'll be able to download the PDF of the colors that I'm using, the colors, the manufacturers that I use, and the box that I'm using here. So you can find that information if you want to. I'm going to use quite a few colors in this one today. I'm going to be using cerulean, Prussian, ultramarine, the three blues, burnt sienna, quinacridone gold, touches of cadmium red and yellow. I'm going to use a green that's pre-made, a Windsor green, yellow shade, neutral tint, and titanium white. So quite a few colors go into this particular one. This is my source material for the subject that I'm working with today, and you'll see that I've changed it quite a bit in the painting. I've changed the whole of the right-hand side completely. I've left out a lot of things. I've added in a few other things. And so I advise you, or I recommend that you do that as much and as often as you possibly can. Here's my tonal study. Before I start, I want to know where I'm going. I want to know what needs to be a middle tone, what needs to be a dark tone, and what needs to be a light tone. And so usually I make these on toned paper. And the tone of the paper is a middle tone. So to be able to make the lights and darks, all I have to do is to add in the lights and add in some of the darker tones, the darker middle tones and the darker tones. And I feel that this looks more like a painting when it's done, rather than making my sketches on watercolor paper. So here is my drawing for this subject. And you'll see that the drawing has a lot of detail. A lot of that detail would just end up being slightly suggested as a pencil line in the background. It's the same amount of detail that I put on this painting when I drew it. I put on the paper. But you can see a lot of that got washed out. A lot of it is left as suggestion. And so I'd rather have more detail than not enough. And so I usually put in just a little bit more than I need. Okay, I'm raising the paper up just a little bit so that I can have the water run down the paper as I add it. I'm going to use a large brush. You could use a flat brush. Today I'm going to just use a mop brush, a brush that holds a lot of water. I'm going to start by wetting the paper completely. It doesn't matter where everything is at this point, because the only thing that's important right now is establishing a really nice, large, basic wash that goes all the way through. Okay, so saving the whites is not a problem right now. Some of the whites I'm going to add on afterwards, and I'm going to be careful about not making areas in the background too dark. But I'm letting that sit for just a minute or two. Just wipe the edges when you do that, because they tend to bleed back into the painting. You'll notice that I have my tape, my favorite tape around here, and I use that tape particularly because it's a light middle tone. It's a very, very helpful tool for knowing how dark or how light your washes are when you first start to paint. It's really hard to know when you have a large area of white paper like this, how light or how dark the colors are going to be when you start to put them on the paper. This is a light middle tone, so I know that I want my first wash, and I'm going to show you the first wash that I did on this painting on my iPad, just so you can see. I want you to be able to see that the first wash is slightly darker than a middle tone in some places, slightly lighter and much lighter than a middle tone back there. And you can see how the tape allows you to be able to see those tones a little bit more clearly when you're putting the paint on. So it's really helpful, really, really helpful to use that tape. This is the tape from the hardware store that is made for delicate surfaces, and so it won't tear the paper. It's a 3M tape. So I've got a nice shiny surface here. I'm just going to lift up a little bit of that water at the bottom. And I'm just talking to you while that's soaking into the paper, because I really want it to be nice and wet, so I've got plenty of time to work with that wash. So while that's working, I'm going to, while that's just wetting up there. I'm going to start making up some of the colors that I'll be using for this area. And I'm definitely going to need cerulean blue. That's going to give me a nice tone in the background. So we'll have a nice big puddle of that. Cerulean for the sky, cerulean for cooling down some of the browns. And because this is a small palette, I can't make large amounts of color. I'm using a neutral tint instead of having to make too many strong dark colors there, because I also want to use ultramarine and burnt sienna for some darker tones too. So cerulean's a good one to start with. I'm going to use some burnt sienna. I'll need quite a bit of that, so we'll mix up a big puddle of that. And most of these are going to be added on top of each other on the painting to begin with. I'm waiting for that shine on the surface of the paper to disappear. Can you see it still there? As soon as the shine disappears, I know that I have a little bit more control over where the paint goes. If you start to paint right away now, it'll shoot all over the place, and you won't have nearly as much control as you need. So we'll wait for just a minute or two for that to work. And of course, it never dries as quickly as you want it to, when you want it to. It always dries slower. Okay, so I've got cerulean, I've got ultramarine. I'm going to have a little bit of Prussian blue too for the darker, cool blue. Have that ready to go as well, because there are some darker areas in there. And I'm going to have a darker blue, warm grey with ultramarine and burnt sienna. Most of the buildings are warm-toned in this subject, and so I will keep that warm tone, but need just a little bit of this too, and a lighter version of that nice warm grey as well. So brownish grey. All right, and just a little bit more of that burnt sienna there. So I think that's probably good to go for the first wash. I can't think of anything else that I would need more than that. And we're getting close to being ready for this. What happens if you raise your paper up and you start at the top of the painting is, by the time you get to the bottom of the painting, it's still nice and moist. If you leave the paper flat, it will tend to dry out more evenly, and it usually takes a little time to paint from the top down. And so raising the paper up helps that flow of water. So now I have to estimate how light or how dark I want this first background area to be. And the first background area is the sky. And I need it to be, when it dries, lighter than the tape. The tape is a light middle tone. Okay, so I need that sky to be light, but I have to know that on 300-pound paper, everything will dry much lighter than on 140-pound paper. So I need to make sure that I have enough color to make that work. And I'm going to add just a little touch more at the top there to make that work. Okay, I'm going to move right on out into just about enough room here, I think, to work on this. Right out into some of the buildings in the background here. And I'm not concerned about anything right now except connecting a large wash from one side of the painting to the other, trying to maintain some of the lighter tones that I know need to happen. That one's just a little dark. Let me add just a little bit of that to the burnt sienna there. There we go. If the paint runs into areas that I don't want, I can lift it up at this stage, or I can leave it and not worry about it. And just paint. So long as the subject is going to be a little darker, it won't make any difference if the paint is just a little bit lighter and covering in some areas. Okay, so we're looking at that. I'm going to be adding lots and lots and lots of layers to this before I'm finished, before it dries. I want to get that mix of brown and blue working pretty nicely here before I move into the warmer tones coming forward. Using a middle tone blue because I can control the tonal value more easily than if I use a darker tone to begin with. As I come towards the front, everything's going to get just a little warmer and also just a little darker. The man on the pavement here is going to be wearing dark clothes, so I'm not concerned about making him work. And I just want to make sure that we have enough interest here. And what I'm doing is I'm working carefully around the cars. Everything else is going to be in the same sort of shadow, so I'm not concerned about working around anything else. Basically, the tops of the cars are going to be important, so I'll work around those a little bit. And bringing that cool tone forward and darker, slightly darker. And this is going to take a little while because the paint sinks into 300-pound paper and disappears almost as though you've never added it. And so you have to keep making more and more paint if you're working wet in wet. And it's a good idea because that way you can really think about what you're doing. So I'm mixing up same mixtures again, just a little bit more paint. Now before I get too much further, I'm just going to add in a bit of a dark tone down in the foreground here. Before this starts to dry too much, so I can keep it all nice and wet. Keep this blue coming through here. That can go all the way through the car. And a little of that on the sidewalk too. And a much darker tone down here. This is eventually going to be quite a bit darker, and so I'm going to start with that idea of it being quite a bit darker to start with. Now there aren't too many lights in here except for the lights of the the cars, and so I'm going to keep that tone going across here to extend those colors into this area. And I will be lifting back. There's a little bit of bleed there. You can see that can be lifted back, and I'll be lifting out those headlights to help that light tone as I go. So let's have a little bit more of that blue feel down here. As well as the brown in this area. Ultimately, what I'm aiming for in this first wash is to get an overall middle tone. Lights in the middle here. This is a middle tone and some darker tones in the foreground. And it just takes a while to build up these colors. So keep adding more and more paint. And the advantage of the 300-pound paper is it just stays wet long enough for you to be able to play with it and do this. So you think when you first start doing this that you've got a lot of paint on the paper, but that's not how it works. Just a little bit more of the blue in here to connect with the back part. Okay. Just a little bit of tone along the sidewalk there. Some of these tones need to be darker here. If your paint, when you're working on this type of surface, if the paint that you're putting on has less water in it than the surface of the paper, you have a lot of control. The paint will go where you want it to and it won't spread all over the place. If your paint is very watery at this stage, then you're not going to have much control and it's going to go everywhere. And so the amount of water in the paint is really important. Just a little cooler on this one, and then move it to just something just a little bit warmer as we come forward. Okay, just a little bit more of the cool back here. That feeling of something being in there. Washed out and in the mist back there. Now that's bleeding out just a little bit, but it's not a big deal. It's dry enough that it's not going too far. Okay, let's have a little bit more colour down here in the ground area. Going down to Prussian blue now to add some darker tones down here. And I'm not thinking about details, I'm not thinking about anything other than what do I need to do for this wash to start with. And then we'll start thinking about the details. And I do want to keep this idea of the light coming all the way through the center. So that's really important. We can have just a couple of little suggestions going across there. And the sidewalk can just be a little bit darker here too. Just a touch. Okay, I'm going to go just a bit darker down here. I could stop there, but I don't want to stop there because I don't think it's dark enough yet and it's going to dry lighter. And so I'm trying to avoid that drying lighter idea. Just going to get a little bit of blue in here just to connect those colours up a bit. Just a touch more of the darker tone over here. And everything will get just a bit darker later. I'm trying to capture the mood of this painting before I do anything else. like the fact that cerulean has a texture also. It gives a little granular texture in the painting. And nice that it does that. All right, I'll go in now with just a touch darker using the neutral tint and a little burnt sienna. Neutral tint is a little mixture of colors, black and red and blue, and it darkens things quite quickly. If you mix it with other colors, it has advantages if you want to put in a nice strong dark. A bit of that on this side too. See how this is fading out? Needs to be a little darker. And the sidewalk is going to need to come down in tone just a little bit more. Particularly on that side. I'm not worried about this bleeding over the figures. The figures will stand out by themselves. That won't be a problem. If I wanted a yellow umbrella, I'd be concerned, but that's going to be darker, so that's not a problem. And we'll leave a little light under the cars coming through from behind. And have just a little bit of tone under that one. And a little bit of tone coming down under that one to start with. Okay. Right, I'm going to tone this down just a wee bit in the foreground here. And I'm going to lift out a few things. I'm going to lift out a little bit of light down here. Even that out just a bit. A bit more light in there. I'm going to lift out the feeling of the headlamps. Ultimately, they're going to be lighter. Let's just start with the idea of that's where they're going to be. And that gives a nice soft edge for those two. And I will be painting across those and adding some goodies into them. So this first wash is really key to making the painting connect throughout. And most subjects actually can be done like this, with a nice wet and wet wash. Need just a little more tone up here underneath this one. Ultimately, I'll put some more color on here, of course, but right now I'm just going to darken these just a little bit. While the paint is still wet, that gives a nice soft edge to that tone. Okay. So now I'm looking closely and take a slightly smaller brush. And I'm going to lift out a few areas where the paint has bled over just a little bit. So I'm going to lift out the top of the car here, so I can have a nice clean color for that. The top of this car, and this one too. This one here is going to be fairly light, so I'll lift that out as well. And this one's going to be dark, so it's not a problem. A little bit of color on this sidewalk over here. So these are complementary colors, the blue and the brown. So they kind of pop against each other, which is kind of nice. So this is the key to making this happen, making it work. Okay, a little bit of dark in there while it's still wet. And let's see if we need to do anything else before that dries down, just a bit more. I think maybe just a bit more tone on the sidewalk. Still just a tiny bit damp at the bottom, but not now at the top here. It's dried enough up here for me to be able to work on that. So just a little bit of tone there. Okay, we'll do one more little lift on the headlights here. This is still just a little bit more moist down here than the top of the painting. I did staple this paper down onto a board. It will buckle, as you can see, it's buckling just a little bit, but it will flatten out as it dries. You don't have to stretch this paper by putting it in water to start with. It's not necessary. Before I do this, I'm just going to darken this area just a little bit more. I need just a bit more of a tone across here to make that work. Using a little Prussian, using a little sienna. So I'm aiming for that idea of a middle tone. You can see it bled out just a little bit back there, but it's not going to interfere with the painting at all. It's going to work just nicely. It's not a problem. These little edges are kind of nice too. We can take across here now, just a few of those. So pretty much the whole painting, when you think about it, is really developed in this first wash. Okay, let's have a little bit of color. Oops, too much. Just a little bit of color underneath there and down there. Just separate those two cars a bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good right now. I think we're good to go on that right now. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let this dry just for a minute. Well, actually, as I touch it, it's okay. I can work on it. It's not too wet. So I can continue. I'll just give it a little help though with the hairdryer. Okay, if the people were wearing bright white clothing, I would make sure that I lighten those up a little bit, but they're not, so that's not a problem. And now I'm going to move into working a little bit darker on the sides and Not too much detail on here, but just moving from the outside in to get a little bit of detail in the buildings here. To start with a dark brown, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. It's my favorite dark brown. Just a little bit more. Bring that over so you can see what I'm doing. Just a little bit more burnt sienna in there. I'm going to add in a tiny touch of neutral tint to this to calm it down just a bit. And just check that on a piece of paper here. Yeah, that's fine. So I'm going to work on this side of the painting. Drip on there. So the paper is dry to touch, but it's still buckled a little bit, which means that the back of the paper isn't dry completely yet. Now this time I'm going to be a little bit more careful about saving the figure. And what I want on this building is some suggestions of texture or shapes. So I'm just going to put this on this section first. Let it dry down just a little bit. I didn't tell you today that I'm using Fabriano paper. I often use Arches. I use both, actually. The reason I'm using Fabriano paper is because it has a softer surface, and so I get a softer finish on the painting. And for a rainy scene, that's very helpful. And so Fabriano Artistico works just as well as Arches, and it's a softer paper because it's made with cotton balls and not rag, and it actually has a few advantages at times like this. It's warming this up just a little bit because it's facing us, and I want it to be a slightly different tone from the area next to it. Now, while this is drying, I'm going to lift out. I'm a great fan of lifting things out of the paper to suggest possibilities of structure, or we're not quite sure what, but back here, just revisit a bit of that. So I've got the suggestion of a possibility for the surface of that. Just pull out a little bit more down there. Just find it easier to do lines sideways on. Okay, so that gives us the beginning of some structure in that area. There's a little detail on this building. So I'm just going to lift that out a little bit. I don't want to paint it in dark tones, but I want to suggest that there's something in that space. It'll just be a little suggested detail there. Just a small amount of detail on the building is going to be enough. Try that one more time. These buildings are very complicated. There's no reason for that. When we're painting, we don't need to make it that complicated. We just need a little suggestion of detail that says, this is what's happening on this building, perhaps. It's going to be slightly darker than the front area. This little area in here is going to be darker. So I'm going to do a little negative painting within this space, just to pull out a detail in there. These will probably have to be a little bit darker later, but this is a good start. And what I want to do is, as I move backwards, I want less detail, less information. And so I'm aiming for that. Let me just pull that back a little bit. That might be easier to pull out when it's a little drier. So this is a little overhang here. There's some sort of sign on the wall inside there. So we'll just paint around that. Let's come down to the car. And really I'm using these dark tones to pop the car out. That's about where the sidewalk will go. So let's stop right about there. And there will be a tree in here eventually, quite a few trees. I'll just paint right over the street lamp. I'm going to run this down, let the light come in here just a little bit. Remembering that 300-pound paper always dries a bit lighter. And so make sure that we have just a little bit of light in there. That outside edge needs to be a little bit lighter too. So hold on to that. This building can have a suggestion of detail, but it really doesn't need much. Next building I'm going to leave pretty much the way it is. I'll just give a little bit of a suggestion of a break in the building there. The next building is facing me, and so I'd like to have maybe some windows showing, partly showing in this one. So let's have those coming out like that. The front edge will be lighter. This will be a little darker alternately, but I'll get the windows in first. What I'm trying to do is to give the idea of interest without trying to make too much detail. Lost a little bit of an edge here. A flat brush works really well for lifting out edges that you've lost. Just make it damp and put it on the sponge, and that will work really well. Okay, so we're going to go with that one. So in this area, I think we just need a little bit of a suggestion of windows, perhaps. Let's put some window surrounds in there. You can add some window color afterwards. That idea in there. Perhaps down here, just a suggestion of an opening. Maybe some really light windows. Window color, good window color is Prussian blue and burnt sienna. Makes a nice sort of sea green window color. There we go. And all of those colors are working within the color range that we've got here. So just a little bit of that feeling of green in there. I can use that same color for a suggestion of windows back here. How much detail do we really need to say that they're buildings? Do we really need much more than that? Probably not. This is going to be just a little darker when I've finished this panel here. I'm running light against dark all the way through. And so back here we'll have just a touch more of a warm tone, I think, and just a little bit more dark. It's getting a bit too light. Everything's very just a little bit too light back here, so I'm just going to go over with another tone in this area that will darken it just a little bit. Okay, and even this one could be just a touch darker. And that's one of the problems with 300-pound paper. It dries much lighter. There we go. That feels better now. And we'll have a little bit more blue on this last building. So I'm just adjusting the tones. So when you think in terms of the whole painting like this, it's so much easier to not have a lot of detail. That's just a bit too strong. Just the tiniest amount of blue here. Oh, this one. Okay. Just a little lifting back here. Isn't really necessary, but do it anyway. And on this one, I'm just going to lift up a little bit on this side. Just lose that just a little bit. There we go. Okay. All right, and this needs to be connected just a little bit more because it's too light in relation to everything else there, so it just needs another little tone of paint coming across here. And we'll loose this down just a little bit too. There we go. Now everything connects up just a little better. And it's reading a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to move to let that dry down just a bit. I'm going to move to the other one. Straighten it up a bit. I actually think those would look a little better, just a touch lighter. Since this is away from the light, everything's going to be just a little bit darker on this panel. You can lose those windows a bit. I'll come back and redo those in a moment. Okay, this needs to be just a little bit lighter. Okay, that's working pretty nicely. And down here we can have just a touch more tone right down at the base of the buildings. The light is coming through here and catching the edge of this building, but it's not terribly light. And this one is facing us, so it needs to be just a little darker. It's out of the light. So darken that a bit. That comes down behind the figure all the way down there. Okay, this side also just a touch darker. Just a few windows up in these this side of the building. It's just a little bit too dark. That's better. These windows can be just a bit darker on this one, the next building. It's too wide for that side of the building. I just need to take some of that out. Just let that dry down and I'll come back and do that again. We have a doorway or a window or something here. We're not quite sure what it is. Looks like it could be a window here, so we'll put that in down to about there. Don't want that to be too dark because I'm playing that against the figure, and so I don't want it to be too strong. And this doorway could be just a little darker. Add a little blue brown mix there. Okay, I'll darken the inside of the door frame just a little bit. Put a little bit more tone over this, and then I'll come back and add that window in afterwards. A bit more warm tone up there. Okay, there's a step here that needs a little shadow. Doorway in that building, and I think we're pretty good to go on this now. Just need that to dry a bit so I can tighten it up. Still just a little bit damp here. Okay, so I'm happy with the fact that in that big wash, I've managed to capture everything that I wanted initially. Now we can go on to the little details, different parts of the subject. So there really isn't much detail to do in this painting except for the cars and the people on either side, and then just a little bit more information here in the foreground to make this work. We have a couple of trees here that would work, and then I'll adjust a few of these tones and make sure they look correct and the way they should be. So just touch more tone on the side of this building, I think, before we stop. I'll put those windows back in afterwards. And now would be a good time to let everything dry down for 5 or 10 minutes. And you can see that with minimal detail so far, the buildings are looking like buildings, but they don't have all of the detail and definition of the subject. The subject has a lot of busyness, has a lot of information in all of these areas up here, and that's really not necessary. It's not important in this painting. This painting is all about the reflections in the foreground, and so I don't want to take away from that idea of what it's all about. So detail. Detail is minimal here. I'm going to start with the idea of the trees that I see. And on this street, as I look at the source material, there's a tree here. And if I look down the street, there are little trees all the way along the street. Okay, so I'm going to add those in right now to start with and overlap those a little bit and make sure that as I go further back, I lighten them. For that, I'm going to use Winsor Green Yellow shade. Winsor Green Yellow shade is a horrendous color unless you add it to other things. But it works really nicely for this type of green, and it's nicely transparent. So I keep it on this palette just because it's useful. But on its own, it doesn't look like anything, anything that you could see in nature. And so you have to modify it with a lot of different colors. And one of the main colors I use for that is quinacridone gold. And that will take it down into a green that at least feels like it might be real. And then if I want to darken it a little bit, I can add either neutral tint or I can add a little burnt sienna to darken it and warm it a bit. And that would work. I could add a little blue, a little Prussian blue, to darken it a bit more. We'll test that and see what that looks like. That's a pretty nice dark color for the tree here. That'll work pretty well. The tree's pretty much a silhouette. And so I want to make that work. I put that in now so that I can start to think in terms of darks. We really haven't got to darks yet. We're in the place where we're looking at dark middle tones. Just a little bit of dark down here, but it's really not a true dark. When you see a true dark next to what I'm doing, okay, you can see what I'm talking about, right? The true darks actually bring the painting to life eventually. And right now we're about halfway there, 2/3 of the way there, perhaps. All right, let's just test that on here and see how this goes. I'm looking for something that looks tree-like, that has little branches and a good shape. It's all about shape. After shape, it's all about tone. So I'm looking for something right now that has a good shape and also the right tone. Let's take that tree around the post. Wouldn't really matter, the post is going to be darker anyway, but we'll just make it a little bit more solid down here. A little bit looser at the edge. It's really all you need with trees, is just a few edges that are a little looser. And we'll open it up just a little bit as it comes through here and through, where are we? Through here, I guess. Yeah, just a little bit through there. So this is basically a silhouette, and that's really what I'm looking for. And it'll come down into some dark brown branches. Some of those can go up into the tree. Some of them will go out here. Just a touch more edge on there. Bring it out just a little bit more. That feels a bit better. Okay, a few more goodies on this side, and that should do it. I'll stop there with that. And I'm going to use the same color, but lighter, with just a little bit more water in the mix. Back here for some trees. As we see them come through, they'll disappear into the building, and that's kind of what we want. We want them to be there, but not to be there. The last one is up here. Oh, Bakersfield, great. Okay, so that kind of gives us an idea of where those trees are going, all the way through from one side to the other. And really light suggestion of tree back there. I'm going to put a suggestion of some goodies along the horizon line back here. We could have a light maybe that's hanging down, or we could have a few little figures or something going on. We're not quite sure what it is. It could be more cars back there, but we just want a suggestion of stuff. I don't really know a better word for that. Stuff. Just something that is happening back there, but nothing too major and nothing too dark. I'm going to add just a little bit more silhouette to this building in the background. Just a touch more back here. Seems to have lost its color just a little bit. There we go. Now we can see that there's a building back there. All right, the joys of £100, £300 paper. Okay, so we're good to go with that. And now details towards the foreground. I'm going to put the cars in first before I go any further. I'm kind of moving forward. So let's go back over here and let's decide what colors we want the cars to be. In the picture, this one is brown, brownish grayish tone. Got a lot of brownish grayish, but that's okay. It'll work. Make it just a little bit warmer. And since it's coming towards us, it could be a little warmer anyway. Let's go just a little bit lighter on that. There we go. Yeah, look at that. Just a suggestion of tone to start with. Separating out the parts of the car because it's easier to read them that way. But they're really just shapes. It's all about shapes. Paint that, I'll add in a little grill on that afterwards. And this one needs to be slightly different color. This is slightly different blue. Too much. Some of this color will be lightened up afterwards when I've finished, if it needs to be. Okay, we're going to have a darker blue one on this side. Or bluish black tone on this side. So we've got some red reflections from the back view of the car. This was a one-way street in the picture, so I changed it into a two-way street. Saving the little spaces for the lights there. Just doing a little negative painting around those. Come back and do the bumper afterwards. Bumper, is that an English term? Can't tell, can't remember. A lot of the car parts are different in England. Since I'm not really a car person, I don't remember things like that. And we'll get to the tires in a moment. And this little van is going to be a light grey or light tone of some sort. Let me see, maybe something like this, just a light neutral. So those of you who know cars well are probably going, oh, that's not right. That's not how it should be. I apologize for that. And I will say it is artistic license. Ah, okay. They are bumpers, so it's fenders that are different then. We have wings instead of fenders. And we have windshield instead of windscreen instead of windshield. And a boot at the back of the car. So I'm going a little black now for this is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Makes wonderful greys and blacks. Okay, I'll finish those off afterwards. Just get those in right now so that we have time to dry down. bit of reflection in there too. There's quite a bit of reflection on those actually, so I'll just do a little dry brush across there to indicate that. Two of these in this one. Okay, that's a good start. Need a little bit of detail on the pathway here. You can have some bit of definition up to about there, and from then on it almost disappears. So the pencil line works pretty well for that, but I'll give it just a little bit of help with a touch of line. Relatively, there's very little detail so far. If you've noticed that relatively I haven't painted a whole lot of detail. I've suggested a lot of things, which is what I'm aiming to do, but I really haven't painted a lot of finished detail because it isn't necessary. I captured everything we needed to say really in that first wash. And now it's just icing, a little bit of icing on the cake. So I know I have a few windows to put in up here, but you know, do they really need it? Maybe. Could they be just suggested? Yes. Could be. And I need just a little bit of brown on the outside there to tighten that up a bit. Maybe just a little bit more information on the sidewalk here before I do the people. Just a little bit more detail of some tones that are suggested here. Okay. And coming through to the edge of the sidewalk, I think we need just a little bit of suggestion of break up there in a few places. And eventually there'll be some shadows behind the people. Amazing, I put a dark in there and it's disappeared completely. Right along here. There we go. Now it's better. Okay, so we're good to go on that. All right, let's paint this little guy over here first. And I'm going to go with an umbrella that is dark, I think. You don't want him to pop out too much. So I'll give him just a little bit of a dark umbrella and make him more of a silhouette over here. Need to add a bit more of a dark brown next to his head in the background. People are pretty easy if you remember that from the head to the top of the legs is equal to the feet to the top of the legs. Okay, so basically people are pretty much proportionally the same from the head to the top of the legs and from the top of the legs to the feet. And so that's a good thing to remember when you're painting people. What sort of jacket shall we give him? I think maybe he could have a dark red jacket. Reddish brownish. Something a little dark. There we go. Just want a little tiny bit of colour over there, but not too much. So he's supposed to be in the shadows over there. He's on the side of the stage. And he's just walking along, minding his own business. Give him a little suggestion of, and I'll tighten up all those little whites around him afterwards. So that will work right now. Let's go to these people on this side. I'm going to give her a colour that connects with the rest of the painting, so she can have a nice cerulean jacket. She's got long hair. And some dark pants. Need a little tone inside the pants there on the street, because it's a little bit too light. And it's just a little wider at the bottom there. Just a little too wide on that. Okay, and give him a brownish jacket too. Okay, a little bit of black for the umbrellas here. And I really don't want to add a colour to these umbrellas because I really want you to look at the cars more than the people. So there's enough colour in the people to make that work pretty nicely. So I'm going to keep the umbrellas dark on this one. There's a little light area underneath the umbrellas, a light shadow. I'll wait until that's dry down just a bit before I add that in. I'll give that figure a little bit more shape afterwards. Right, a little shadow, cast shadow on the ground area behind these guys would be a good idea. Photograph, the cars have a lot of reflection in the windows, so I'm going to paint just a little bit of a diagonal mark across the windows and leave those pretty light. And this one actually knows a little darker. And if these end up being a little bit too light, then we'll paint in just a bit more afterwards. The bumpers. Okay. Just a touch more dark underneath here. Just a little bit. What I'm looking for is this sort of idea of the darker reflection down here. You can see because we've started to add dark in other places that the dark here is not adequate, nowhere near dark enough. So now it has to be really dark. And of course, this will dry down a little bit lighter too. Always. A little quinacridone gold in there too to give it a little bit more life. Puddles over here that have a little reflection in them. You can just suggest those too. To darken that sidewalk on that side just a wee bit. Just a bit too bright. There we go. That's better. Okay, so moving on up with that dark. quite so much across the center here. It's a little bit brighter in this area. So I'm going to warm that up just a little bit. I'm painting over the headlights because I'm going to be using a little gouache for those. The headlight reflections. But I needed to know where they were. If I paint over them at the beginning, then I'm in trouble. It's better to save them first. Just a little bit of a blue feel down here at the bottom. Oops, wrong blue. There we go. A bit more of that feeling of blue in the street down here. It's a good feeling of blue all the way across here too. Just a touch. So I'm changing the color but not the tone here. Down here I'm changing the tone a little bit more. Technically there's a little white sidewalk strip there, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. Again, you have to be really, well, I find that you have to be really careful how many details you put in, and keep your eye on the prize of what it was you wanted to say to begin with. And what I really wanted to say was, I want you to look at the street reflections. I want you to understand that it's a wet, rainy street. And so I'm trying to keep that in mind all the time. Trying not to do anything to detract from that. Okay, all right, so she's carrying a little bag here. Use a little tiny bit of red for this because there's a few little red accents and white accents throughout the subject here, so give her just a little bit of a red bag to a little bit of life to that idea. On little figures like this, you can use burnt sienna for skin tones, if you can see the skin. And if not, then obviously you don't need to. And we need to darken this leg just a little bit so it goes forward. Right up there. That's it. And his legs could be tightened up just a little bit more too. Okay, I'm okay with that now. Just a little bit of a shadow under here. Okay, you want to see what neutral tint looks like by itself? It looks like this. It's a sort of greyish, purplish. It's got a little red in it, it's got a little blue in it, it's got a little black in it. So it's a good neutral colour that you can use. It's a little bit like Payne's grey though. You've got to be careful not to overuse it, and it can become a crutch if you're not careful. So I'm going to use it occasionally in areas where, particularly in this palette, because I can't mix big colours, big amounts of lots of different colours. This palette's just a little bit limiting that way. Okay, run that into that just a going to do also is to use a tiny little bit of pastel pencil in this when I'm finished, and you'll see why. And it's kind of a useful tool that we can use. All right. Now the areas underneath the cars appear to be just a bit too light now that everything else is painted in. So I'm just going to turn them down a little bit. And then we'll start to work on the rest of the cars. Just a touch too light under there. There we go. And these guys need to have just a little bit more color too, because they're against the light. I like this lifting idea of taking things out rather than painting around just to suggest shapes. Okay, I think we're good to go on that. That's reading well. I need the back part of this fan to be just a little bit darker, or I need the area behind it to be just a little bit darker, because those two tones are the same right now, and that doesn't work. So I'm going to make this just a little darker. Going back into the distance. Okay. Right, so we're getting close here. Just a few more little suggestions of darks across here before we work on this headlamps. And it seems to me that the windshields are too light, so I'm just going to turn those down a bit. And I'm going to use a little pencil on that later. Okay, that's a little better. That white paper is so powerful. Okay, we're good to go on that. Right, I think it's time to start thinking about those reflections now. I'm going to use some white gouache for that. I'm fine where I put it here. Best laid plans of mice and men. Put my gouache out so it would be handy. And now I'm not seeing it. Oh, it's because it fell down. All right, so when you're using white gouache, it's going to look tremendously white when you first put it on, but it's going to grey down and darken. Light colors in gouache always dry darker, and darker colors in gouache always dry lighter. And so I'm going to use just a little bit of gouache in the palette. I'm also going to use a yellow to make these lights up here to glow just a little bit more. So I'll use cadmium yellow for that. It's a nice warm yellow. So let's see what we can use for this. Cadmium yellow here, ready to go. And the white is going to add a little water to it. I'm going to start by spreading out the headlights just a little bit because they have a bit of a contrast. They tend to star out a little bit, so I'm going to make them just a little bit bigger with the gouache than I see them. And on the edges of these, I'm going to add a little yellow. Oops, too much. Now the gouache that I'm using right now is pretty thin. It's going to dry darker, and I may need to add just a little bit more in the center to lighten it up a little bit. This looks terribly white when you first put it on. It never stays that way. So I'm making the headlights bigger than they actually are to take into account that glare, that spread of light. Particularly on a wet day, that would be much more evident. These little guys are going to be red, so we'll wait on those a little bit. We can start to put in some of the suggestions of the reflections down here. See a little dry brush for this. Well, this looks too white until we're done. I'll soften off the edges of those in a minute. This one's actually pretty solid all the way through. So let me just thicken that up at that place, in that place. And here too, they're pretty solid all the way down to about there. Oops. Some of this might need to be lifted just a little bit. Down to about there. And this one not quite so much. This one maybe just down to about there. Now while that's settling down, I'm just going to soften up those edges with a damp brush. Just let it spread out just a little bit. I didn't want to wet the paper first because that tends to dilute the paint too much. So we can add a little more white in here if we need to. I think that'll work for quite nicely for now. Cadmium red, fortunately, is a red that will sit on top of other colors. And so I'm using a little cadmium red now for for the car lights that are towards the back. And usually those lights will look just a little bit more yellow or orange at the top. So a little red underneath, like that. And then I'm going to put a little yellow on top of that red. I'm going to do the same down here on the street. I'm going to add just a little bit of yellow towards the top. Bring those down. I will soften them off in a minute. Makes the car lights look brighter if you add the little yellow in there. Just a touch more of that red. There you go. Okay, so for these guys, drying up just about. I'm going to put just a little yellow around the outside edge of these. See how that gives it a bit more life and makes it look a little bit more real, softer. And I may need to darken just a touch while I'm here. Just going to darken just a touch on the front of the car here. It's just a little bit too light. It can be that light on the side because it's catching a little bit of the light, but not quite so much. Coming down here. That will dry just a little bit lighter. Now, of course, we have to take that idea of the yellow down into the street as well. Otherwise, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. So that can come down on the outside of these. And I'm going to run just a little bit more white in there to connect those up together. And then we'll run some of the street lines across these. It had just a little bit too much yellow on this side. Lift that up. Okay, I'll let that dry down just a second. Just a few little touches of tone in there. Slightly darker tone across here. Okay, now let's cross those with little browns and greens. More little finishing details here. Okay, we're almost close to being ready here. Just a few little tiny details like the lamps and the signs on the lamps that I didn't put in just yet. Just add those. Nice black for those. Black is very easy to make if your paints are wet, and it's burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And it works very well if the paints are wet. It's really hard to do if paints are dry. So let's take this. This up here. Details give just a little bit of more interest and dimension. On each of those there was a little sign, so I'll add that in. Ooh, that's just a little too wet. Let's try this one. Sign it there. And this one has a little sign on it too. And this one up here as well. It's a little higher up here. Gouache is useful. Very, very useful for adding little goodies along the way. When that's dry, I'll just change it down to something not quite so white if it dries too light. That's okay. A bit of interest in this doorway. That doorway just a bit darker. Some little red goodies going on in the signs and things down here too. That kind of connected to buildings, and just a few little suggestions of colour in a couple of places here. This is a little too light on the front here, needs to be toned down just a bit. This detail on the side of the bump out there. It needs to be there, but it needs to be in the shadow. So you can play with just a few little odd suggestions of detail. Just a little bit too light on the side here too. It's amazing how those little tiny whites show up on the screen. These little light areas really pop out on the screen. Just a bit darker down here to pop that colour out a bit more. Here too, same reason. side, we'll just tighten this up against the umbrella and darken it down here just a bit more. Let's just lighten this up just a little bit more so I can darken it, straighten it up so I can darken it. There we go. Okay, was it really necessary to put these windows in? Probably not. I can put them in anyway, just a bit more. Darken them a wee bit. Anything that's close can be darkened. Anything that's further away doesn't really need it. Okay, the walking man could be tightened up a bit. He could be painted white, but he's standing out quite well. So I'm just going to tighten him up a little bit. And leave him just like that. Just a little bit of light in a few places now. Little tiny touches of light in a few places where we might need to. Let's take a look and see how we can do that. Okay, so if, for example, the top of the car was not light enough, or maybe it had a little bit of a shine on it because of the light, you could add in a touch of pastel. Lighten this one up just a little bit more, that one just a little bit more light. So pastel is a really good medium to use for adding in just a few little suggestions of possibilities. We don't know whether this is a door open, door closed, whether it's glass. Let's give it a little feel that it possibly could be. Over here too, just a little suggestion, maybe a light in the window there, a window there. Again, you can use that same light in the car windows, that works pretty nicely. Maybe suggest lights on the street. Just a touch of that. So just tiny little suggestions of goodies would work for that. And here I'm just going to put a little bit of writing on that sign. Maybe add just a little red to it. It's not really a mixed media. No, I don't think so. Gouache is 99.9% or more watercolor. So it's really not considered to be a mixed media when you just use touches of gouache like this. And it's a pastel pencil that I'm using, okay, because I'm also a pastel artist, and so oftentimes the pastels come in handy in other places too. Just going to darken the side of this building just a tiny touch down here. Just feels just a bit too light. And then he could have pastel shirt, perhaps, a little white touch of pastel for a shirt shape. Okay, a bit more stuff going on at the base here. There's always going to be darkness around the bottom of buildings on the ground. That's way too light. It should be light, but not that light. It's not catching that much light. So let that run over. Keep that light and keep that dark. Just tone that down just a little bit more. Okay, that will work. A little bit of dark going up the side of the building there on the corner would be good. Bring that over just a little bit more in that corner. I made that a bit too warm, so I'm just going to cool it down. Okay, now let's take a look at the reflections and see if we need to change those anymore or whether they're working nicely. Let's take a look at the big picture now and see how that's working. Pretty nicely, the light's coming through in a good way. The tree looks a little bit too thin, so I'm just going to add a touch more colour to that to make it a bit more solid in a couple of places. That feels like it works a little better now. So on here, for example, I could just add a little accent with that pencil to separate those out. That would work. I could add in just a touch of suggestion of the umbrella ideas. So that pencil's pretty useful for tiny little accents. Maybe on the edge of this there might be a highlight, the same way that there is on that. So that would be kind of nice to do. Tighten up that edge a little bit with a light. It seems to me as though these pants still need just a little bit more dark. Let me just come back in and do that. The reason I'm using a pastel pencil is because I can make a line with that, or I can't make a line quite as easily with gouache, and gouache always dries a lot lighter. It looks a lot brighter, and the pastel pencil is a little more subtle. So that would be my reason for doing that. just a touch more information in that figure. Okay, so I think we've captured the reflections pretty well there. Just take that back up to the top there, right at the top. Get it nice and bright. Oftentimes you have to use gouache more than once. And when I first put it on, I added a fair bit of water to it. If I want it to really sparkle and really jump out, I'm going to have to use it now more full strength. I think just in the top area there where it comes down from the card, could use that. Okay. And I think it could also use being lost a little bit more down here too. There we go. Okay. Use a tiny little bit of gouache in here for some highlights. That will dry down darker. I think we're pretty good to go on that. Let's take the tape off and see how that looks now. One more thing. I'm just going to add a little bit more gouache to those street signs because they dried down just a bit too dark. I think they're useful little additions to the painting. Watercolor pencil might work, yes, but it doesn't have the gritty effect that pastel pencil has. I've never actually tried watercolor pencil on the surface of something like this. I think pastel pencil probably would work a little better because the surface of the paper breaks off some of the pastel, and so that doesn't happen with watercolor pencil. So if I wanted to lighten up this just a little bit, that would be another thing to do with a pastel pencil. It's just a little suggestion but that's a good question, and I probably should check it out sometime. There we go. A little suggestion of some white path coming through there. Okay. I think we're just about good to go on that. Let's take the tape off and see how that looks. It's always going to look much better without the tape, we hope. Okay, I think we're just about good to go on that. So there are other things I could do. One of them I'm looking at right now is to soften off the red reflection here, break it up just a little bit more. It's a little too solid and too strong. Probably not straight enough either. Let's just break that up a little bit more. Spread it out just a wee bit. Feels a little better. I'm going to take just a touch of the street color across there too. to break that one up a bit as well. There we go. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a lot of fun to paint like that, kind of painting without a life raft or a life jacket initially, but still a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you'll come and join me. Come paint with me next weekend if you'd like to. Thank you again, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.